Salve Miki! Welcome back to Viva Latina and welcome back to our vocabulary review video. In this video, we're going to be talking about the fourth conjugation, especially in the verbs. So, before I start, I want you all to understand that the third IO and fourth conjugation are kind of similar, but they're sometimes really different. Let's first do advenio, and then we will go back and compare this with third IO. Advenio, well, we see the IO. Advenire, that's the infinitive. Adveni, and adventus. That means to arrive. First things which we can see is we have the IO and IRE, adveni, adventus. So, here's one of the biggest mistakes which I see sometimes in students who do vocabulary. They get confused between third IO and fourth conjugation. Why? Because advenio has an IO and a word like yakio also has an IO. That's why it's really important to know the difference between what conjugation a word is in. A fourth conjugation word may look like a third IO word, but you need to understand that there is a fundamental difference, and that difference is evident in when you try to conjugate that verb, which is more of a grammatical idea, but as a vocabulary student, it's important to keep that in your mind. So what do we see? Advenio, we have that IO. But in the infinitive, it's an IRE, which is different than the third IO verbs, which is an ERE, ERE, ERE. This is why a third IO verb is actually more related to the third conjugation. The reason why it's called third IO is because it keeps the IO, which is found in fourth conjugation, but it still has the ERE, which is fundamental to the third conjugation. Next, let's move on to audio. Audio, audire, audivi, auditus. And this means to hear. Next, let's move on to dormio. Dormio, dormire, dormivi, dormitus. This means to sleep. For example, a volcano which is dormant is usually a volcano which is sleeping because it's not active. But I want to go over one thing real quickly. Dormivi is IVI. And that's really similar to cupio, which is IVI in the third participle part. But I want you all to remember the difference between third IO and fourth conjugation, because that difference is extremely imperative. Now let's move on to custodio. Custodio, custodire, custodivi, custoditus. That means to guard. Now we go to invenio. Invenio, invenire, inveni, inventus. Sorry, the S got cut out over here, but there's an S. Inventus, meaning to find. So, I want to compare invenio with advenio. What is the similarity? Well, advenio has the venio, and invenio has the venio. When we look at these words, what do we call them? These are compound words, meaning that they're compounded off of another main verb. And that verb, which we will learn later, is venio. Now let's go to munio, munire, munivi, munitus. And this means to fortify or build. Depends on the context is when you use either fortify or build. Next, this is a really important word. Skio. Skio, skire, skivi, skitus. And that means to know. Something like being conscious of your surroundings comes from skio. But that's more of a derivatives angle. But it's really important to have that in mind while you're learning vocabulary. Next, we move on to venio. That's back to our verb of the main verb and the compound verbs. Remember when we talked about advenio and invenio? That venio and venio are all coming from this venio. So this means venio, venire, veni. I want y'all to keep in mind of the veni, the long E in the third participle part, and ventus. This means to come. Now let's move on to irregular verbs. There are two major irregular verbs which you need to know as a level 1 too. The first one is something you may already have seen in class. Sum. Sum esse fui futurus. Again, there is no real pattern you can find in sum. That's why it's irregular. So make sure you memorize that it's sum esse fui futurus. If you say it multiple times, it'll be ingrained in your brain. And the more you translate, you'll be able to understand and identify sum. And this means to be. To be. This might seem really awkward because when we learn English, we never really have a definition of be. Like, what does to be exactly mean? Well, sum acts mostly as a linking verb. Sum by itself is generally a linking verb, and you'll learn that as you progress in your Latin class. So, now let's move on to our second irregular verb, possum. Possum, posse, potui. Now, let's go back to the same idea of why aren't there 4 principal parts? There was another verb which we learned which did not have 4 principal parts, and that was in the second conjugation. That verb was timeo. Remember, it was timeo, timere, timui. There was no 4th principal part. Same thing with possum. Possum, posse, potui. All you need to know is this means to be able. With that being said, we have just completed our whole unit on verbs. We started with the first conjugation. Then we went to the second conjugation, the third conjugation, the third IO subsect, fourth conjugation, and 2 of the most important irregular verbs. This gives you a general overview for your vocabulary test, and will also provide you great fundamentals for the state forum test around the corner. Thank you so much for following with me. Now, we will talk about nouns in the next video. Thank you so much.